I endured years of humiliation, but the night of the Hearthside Benefit Gala, when they thought I would finally break and sign away everything, they stabbed me in the back by trying to transfer my trustee powers live on stage. I smiled while the room clapped, because I was the one who controlled the payroll, the ACH rails, and the vendor contracts that paid for their lifestyles. I wasn't a penny-pinching wife. I was the court-appointed trustee of Aegis Payroll Trust. Endured years of humiliation, but the night of the Hearthside Benefit Gala, when they thought I would finally break and sign away everything, they stabbed me in the back by trying to transfer my trustee powers live on stage. I endured years of humiliation, but the night of the Hearthside Benefit Gala, but the night of the Hearthside Benefit Gala, when they thought I would finally break and sign away everything, I endured years of humiliation. But the night of the Hearthside Benefit Gala, when they thought I would finally break and sign away everything, I endured years of humiliation. But the night of the Hearthside Benefit Gala, when they thought I would finally break and sign away everything, they stabbed me in the back by trying to transfer my trustee powers live on stage. I endured years of humiliation, but the night of the Hearthside Benefit Gala, when they thought I would finally break and sign away everything, I endured years of humiliation. But the night of the Hearthside Benefit Gala, when they thought I would finally break and sign away everything, endured years of humiliation. But the night of the Hearthside Benefit Gala, when they thought I would finally break and sign away everything, they stabbed me in the back by trying to transfer my trustee powers live on stage. I smiled while the room clapped. I endured years of humiliation, but the night of the Hearthside Benefit Gala, when they thought I would finally break and sign away everything, they stabbed me in the back by trying to transfer my trustee powers live on stage. I smiled while the room clapped, because I was the one who controlled the payroll. I endured years of humiliation, but the night of the Hearthside Benefit Gala, when they thought I would finally break and sign away everything, they stabbed me in the back by trying to transfer my trustee powers live on stage. Endured years of humiliation, but the night of the Hearthside Benefit Gala, when they thought I would finally break and sign away everything, they stabbed me in the back by trying to transfer my trustee powers live on stage. I smiled while the room clapped, because I was the one who controlled the payroll, the ACH rails. I endured years of humiliation, but the night of the Hearthside Benefit Gala, when they thought I would finally break and sign away everything, endured years of humiliation, but the night of the Hearthside Benefit Gala, when they thought I would finally break and sign away everything, they stabbed me in the back by trying to transfer my trustee powers live on stage. I smiled while the room clapped, because I was the one who controlled the payroll, the ACH rails, and the vendor contracts that paid for their lifestyles. I wasn't a penny-pinching wife. I was the court-appointed trustee of Aegis Payroll Trust, and I had already locked every account they expected to pillage. My name is Claire Benton, and I am 31 years old. Before I reveal exactly how I dismantled their lives, let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. Hit like and subscribe if you believe toxic people always get what they deserve. But to understand how they ended up with absolutely nothing, we have to go back to the year I took my secret oath and volunteered to save strangers I would later love like family. When Mark and I married, everyone told me I had married into old money comfort. Ashford Ridge had that close-knit gilded look, manicured hedges, a community tennis court, a library with handwritten donation plaques. The truth was messier. Mark's grandmother Ruth was the real asset in the family. Small estates, a patchwork of rental properties, and Hearthside Senior Living, a scrappy regional chain of 6 homes that paid people on time or not at all depending who you believed. Ruth's companion, Millicent Hawthorne, Millicent, everyone called her Millie, had been there for Ruth for a decade. Millie, in turn, brought her son Trevor and his daughter Brittany into the orbit. Between them, they had learned to walk into rooms and take what they wanted simply by being loud enough. I sat in that orbit and chose silence. It wasn't cowardice. I wore the button-down shirts and the modest wife smile because I needed them to underestimate me. I had reasons to hide what I was. 3 years earlier, after a whistleblower audit exposed a pattern of missing payroll and vendor skimming at Hearthside, I volunteered to be the interim trustee for Aegis Payroll Trust. A judge appointed me because I had the certifications. They wanted a cleaner, someone who could reissue vendor contracts, install oversight, and keep the senior homes from starving. It was the kind of private legal authority no one knew about until you used it. Trustee certifications, signatory controls on ACH rails, an LLC with the master vendor indemnities, Cassia Holdings LLC, which only I controlled. I never told Mark's family. I didn't broadcast to Millicent that I had the power to stop all the ACH instructions that paid for their catered dinners, their installers, the landscapers who cut their hedges. I stayed quiet because I wanted two things. 1, the seniors in those homes protected, and 2, a life without being a target for the kind of people who smelled money and considered family a buffet. So I played poor, small, embarrassed by their jokes about my thrift store dresses and my slow car. Millicent called me Quiet Claire and relished the way Trevor always talked over me at the table. Brittany left chewing insults like gum. Their daily cruelty was small and purposeful. At holidays, they compared me to ex-wives. They borrowed my car and returned it with the fuel gauge empty, and when the subject of money came up in conversation, they leaned in and asked if Mark's wife with the funny job could float a tiny loan for a supposed emergency. They laughed when I declined. They mocked my thrift store lamps as if I had bought them to be artful rather than because I had saved for a rainy day. But the more they gaslit me, the more I watched. I watched bank routing changes, vendor invoices, ACH, rebundles. I read legal filings in the middle of the night. I logged trustee alerts at 2 a.m. Most of all, I watched Millicent's face when the subject turned to trust and inheritance. She believed in ancestral entitlement the way some people believed in prayer. I endured because I had a strategy: silence, presence, and absolute control of a power they could never imagine. It was delicious and dangerous to be underestimated. It protected the seniors and gave me the leverage I'd need when the time came. The plan was ridiculous in its petty creativity, exactly the kind of thing people who never created value themselves hinge their crimes on. Millicent and Trevor cooked up a public spectacle, the Hearthside Benefit Gala, a charity event superficially designed to raise money for new hospice chairs, but in truth, a crooked social engineering ploy. They needed 3 things: my signature, a notarized transfer they could present as consent, and public pressure. Their script read like a particularly cheap opera. They enlisted Jed Caldwell, a small-time lawyer who owed Trevor a favor, to draft a limited beneficiary assignment that, on paper, reassigned emergency payroll authorization from the trustee to a caretaker consortium for the duration of a financial bridge. The wording was purposely legal-sounding and intentionally confusing. A temporary assignment of limited administrative functions under Schedule X-3, revocable only upon joint notarized release. Jed had a notarized stamp and a smile. They assumed I'd be intimidated. They assumed I would be humiliated into signing in front of Ruth's friends. Show of charity, applause, people with checkbooks, an emotional appeal, and most useful of all, witnesses. Trevor had already rehearsed his lines. "Sweet Claire, these old places need hands. You don't have to handle this alone." Millicent would make the moral case. "Think of Ruthie, dear. Think of the residents." Brittany would sob at the podium. They had control, They believed the notarized blip was enough. They would execute a cascade of vendor changes and fake consulting fees and direct deposits into Trevor's shell companies. They had backers in 2 vendor firms who agreed to bill for luxury renovations and split the take. They would siphon a month's payroll and declare that Aegis had been mismanaged and needed immediate sale. Then Mark's name on the deed to my townhouse would be contested using a forged donor deed, purportedly signed years earlier by Ruth. Ruth loved to give away property tokens at community meetings, and their plan included a retired notary willing to sign a fabricated chain of title. The idea was to make my life untenable: eviction, public scandal, and an empty trustee chair they could claim was abandoned. They were greedy and sloppy. They were pedigreed in entitlement and believed that public sentiment plus a notarized sheet meant legal reality. They thought emotion beat law. They thought I was a joke. Their audacity peaked when Brittany told Mark at dinner, "We just need Claire to be nice. She'll sign in front of everyone. People won't embarrass a grieving family." Mark was uncomfortable. He whispered to me that it felt off. I nodded in our kitchen and said nothing. Sometimes silence is a tool. Sometimes it's a test. What they did not know was how the trust threaded through the bank rails. A single signature given under false pretenses would not have been enough. There were threshold triggers, ACH origination rules, vendor master contracts, and an escrow indemnity clause I could invoke that would flip any attempted rerouting into a forensic hold. They couldn't imagine the worlds you open when you hold custody of payroll lines for an entire social safety net. They only saw the shiny prize. So they set the trap: public, moral pressure, and a rogue notary. They used the gala because spectacle is a thief's favorite disguise. When Trevor's consortium asked for the public signature, I already had a blueprint on my lap. I had been quietly preparing for months the moment something like this would appear. In my daily life, while they called me Quiet Claire, I'd been doing things that never made noise: registering LLCs in safe states, stockpiling notarized affidavits proving chain of command, and quietly contributing to an emergency legal fund for Hearthside via micro-donations so it couldn't be traced to me. I had quietly been cataloging every suspicious invoice Trevor's friends sent to the facilities and flagging odd vendor addresses and shell company routing numbers. I had a small team, a trustworthy administrator named Maria at the main Hearthside in Ashford, and an old friend from law school, Emma, who handled forensic accounting for nonprofits pro bono. That week, when Millicent announced the gala, I did what I always do. I watched the feeds. The trustee dashboard pings when there are any unusual authorization changes because I had placed a rule years ago after a former vendor tried to slip a large wire. Any ACH payee change flagged as one-time over $8,000 would require both my certified digital signature and a secondary independent trustee approval. I had the power to decline and simultaneously to flip the account into receivership petitioning. Technically, a trustee like me can petition a court for a conservatory freeze of an operating account if there is probable cause of embezzlement targeting a protected population. That's what I had done the week before the gala, but not publicly. I worked with Emma to draft 2 court-ready instruments that would be usable at a moment's notice. One was an emergency motion, ex parte petition for receivership and freeze of debtor accounts, with a timeline of suspicious transfers tied to Trevor-controlled shells. The other was a trustee certification of incumbency, which effectively allowed me to update bank signatories and remove any temporary assignment requests. I had already filed a small secret notice with the bank holding Aegis payroll rails. Pending forensic review, require trusteeship confirmation and provisional hold for 72 hours on any inbound third-party assignment to Blake or Hawthorne entities. Banks don't like surprises, their compliance teams do. I had my compliance contacts. A woman named Liza at First Union Regional had handled my earlier request. I texted Liza an encrypted file at 3:40 p.m. the day of the gala. If you see a notarized assignment referencing Schedule X, place accounts into provisional freeze and call compliance. This is not a drill. She replied with a hesitant thumbs up that read like prayer. I also prepared the public part. I booked a journalist, small market, righteous, with a penchant for elder care stories. I fed him a timeline showing vendor rerouting, shell companies, invoices padded with hospitality charges linked to Millicent's favorite caterer. I fed him one more thing, a copy of an email Trevor had sent to a vendor with the subject line, "Kickback wire instructions." He thought it was gold. I told him simply, "Wait until the gala." The last piece of my preparation was theatrical. I arranged for the notary they intended to use to be replaced on the dais. Jed had recruited old Mr. Harlan, who owed him favors. I quietly scheduled my own honorary notary to appear at the gig, only the notary wasn't there to notarize. He was a retired court clerk who would, at a precise phrase, stand, pivot, and announce a sealed court hold served the week before. A little stage direction I hope Millicent won't forget. On the morning of the gala, while they polished their lines and selected which porcelain to kiss, I made 3 moves at once. I filed the ex parte petition online. My filing was stamped by Judge Alan Carter in his electronic queue with an urgent banner. I sent a finalized trustee certification to all bank signatories. And I wired an encrypted packet to the journalist with a release, publish at time of freeze. Finally, I set Cassia Holdings to adjust vendor master contracts so that any attempt to add Trevor's corporations as vendors triggered immediate clawback clauses they had never read because they never thought to read anything. I did not feel triumphant then. I felt everything a blade would feel before it cut. Focused, cold, and ready. This is what preparation feels like when it has been years in the making. The gala had all the warmth of a staged funeral. Crystal chandeliers, candlelight, smiles painted on faces that would soon crack. Ruth sat at the head table. Millicent gave her speech about dignity and keeping the homes in the family. Trevor mouthed his lines. Brittany walked the crowd, moist-eyed and theatrical, passing the donation cards. When they called me up, they performed their usual ritual of condescending compliments. "Claire," Millicent said, voice honeyed, "you've done so much quietly. Tonight, let our family support you by letting us help manage while you rest." The room breathed in sympathy the way it breathes in dessert. The notary, Jed's old friend, smiled and presented the parchment he pretended would be the family's salvation. I had rehearsed my face in the mirror, not enraged, not shaken. There is a special silence before you pull a legal lever in public. It's full of a kind of professional calm. When Trevor insisted I just sign, I took the microphone and spoke in a voice so steady the only thing anyone noticed was my composure. "Thank you, Millicent, for the invitation to be generous," I said. "Before I sign anything in front of our friends, I should let everyone know I'm the current trustee of Aegis Payroll Trust. I am the one responsible for payroll and vendor payments for the Hearthside family of homes." You could have heard a spoon drop. A woman at a table made a choking sound. Trevor's smile faltered into a twitch. "I appreciate your concern," I continued. "But because of credible and documented irregularities tied to Trevor Hawthorne Associates and certain vendor accounts, I have filed an ex parte petition with State Superior Court for a provisional receivership to protect the residents. I have also delivered a compliance notice to all payroll banks, which will place provisional holds on any requested assignments until we complete a forensic review." I didn't raise my voice. I released the packet of documents, the judge's electronic stamp, the bank compliance flag, the same email Trevor thought he'd deleted about kickback wires. The retired notary, Mr. Harlan, stood up and, with a theatrical cough, announced, "Ladies and gentlemen, I have been served with a court-ordered freeze regarding certain payments connected to Hearthside." He showed his card, and then, as planned, a plainclothes detective walked up, Not because I'd called the police to arrest anyone for being loud, but because I'd quietly filed a criminal referral with the county fraud unit 2 days before. Detective Rosa Klein, 3 years with elder care fraud on her belt, approached the dais and politely asked Trevor to step aside. There was a collective gasp, then a scramble. Millicent's face blanched, like someone had peeled the lacquer off a porcelain doll. Trevor sputtered a prepared lie. "This is a mistake. Claire, this was meant to be a small, honest transfer." But the journalist in the back, camera rolling, leaned forward. "You told vendor Greenridge to wire hospitality to Trevor Enterprises, Bellevue invoice 227. The journalist read aloud from the email I had released. "This looks like a routing for profit, not care." "Why?" He didn't ask me. He watched the accused squirm. Brittany began to cry for real now. She looked at the audience and begged, but the audience had shifted. In a matter of minutes, the gala turned from a soft plea for donations to a courtroom in miniature. The caterer, mid-service, stopped as the bank told the venue their payment hold was in effect. Guests frowned. Some whispered about refunds. The protesters who had told Millicent it was a scandal suddenly had a scandal that belonged to someone else. I watched each face as their lives cracked. Millicent tried to compose a speech about misunderstandings and protecting the community, but Detective Klein spoke into her radio and said, cold and procedural, "We have probable cause for financial abuse of an elder care entity. We will be executing search warrants at linked vendor addresses." Trevor's palms went pale. If there was an audible moment that belonged to me, it was not when the warrants were read. It was when I looked at Ruth across the table, her eyes wide and not understanding, and I felt an enormous, sorrowful relief. The seniors were safe because the money that paid their aides, their medication, and their coffee would not be rerouted to a limousine or a shell company. "You could have asked me privately," Millicent said, voice thinner than a paper cut. Her entitlement had turned brittle. "You could have not tried to steal from people you were pretending to care for," I replied. "And you could have not thought the theatrical consent of charities would replace law. They clamored, pleaded, and tried to wave the documents as if signatures on parchment were talismans." Jed Caldwell stumbled through self-defense. Trevor tried a last gambit, to charm the crowd, to promise everything will be returned. Detective Klein, in the most human of tones, said, "Promises don't balance ledgers." The bank's compliance officer, called earlier by Liza, stood up and announced the names of Trevor's shell accounts being placed on hold. Social media already had the first clips. The journalist published the first screen grab. People snapped pictures. The gala's glitter turned into the noise of phone shutters, of champagne glasses set down and left untouched. When the officers escorted Trevor and 2 vendors out for questioning, Brittany's sobs morphed into a wail that made even Ruth wince. Millicent knelt on the floor like someone expecting rescue that would not come. The room that applauded in expectation of a charitable signature applauded in stunned silence as the cameras rolled. I stayed through all of it until the last warrant was read. I answered questions from Detective Klein politely, and I watched as a forensic accountant in a Navy suit took Trevor's phone into evidence. My only concession to the crowd was this: the residents will remain paid. Therapeutic services continue. Hearthside's board has appointed an independent receiver pending audit, and I will work with the court to ensure the homes are stabilized. That last sentence, bureaucratic and dry, was the dagger. The receiver appointment was something I had already lined up with Judge Carter. It placed an independent manager in charge of funds and stripped Trevor's of any ability to touch payroll again. They measured their greed. I measured the people whose lives would be harmed if I failed to act. The scales tipped. When the gala ended, the headlines were merciless. "Hearthside Gala ends in fraud arrests," read one. "Family scandal at Ashford Ridge," read another. Social feeds were merciless. Friends I thought were allies carefully detached their comments. Mark's cousins texted him questions about whether he had known. Mark sat on our living room floor with his head in his hands because his family's shame fell like weights you couldn't lift. He had not known the plan in detail, and he was as stunned as everyone else, more hurt than angry. He asked me, plainly and pitifully, "Why didn't you tell me? Why didn't you stop them sooner?" I told him the truth. "I didn't tell you because I'd watched how your family treats love as currency. There are people who would have sold us out to protect an image. I kept my power secret because it was not about us. It was about the residents. I'm sorry you feel betrayed, but I couldn't risk the senior homes." They begged. At first, it was Millicent, pleading through tears to be let go. Then Trevor called our house from the station, voice thin and threatening. "You don't understand what you started." Brittany left us messages about ruining our family. Jed threatened a civil suit for defamation. Their anger lasted longer than their smiles had. But the law is not sentimental. The forensic audits found over $420,000 in suspicious transfers over 2 fiscal quarters. The vendors who had colluded to overbill were put on suspension, and the shreds of Trevor's consulting invoices were enough to get indictment documents drawn. The county moved with the patient efficiency of people who've practiced this before. When I attended the preliminary hearing and sat under the fluorescent lights, the prosecutor's file looked like a damning catalog. People who'd thought social connections would buy them immunity found themselves in line for subpoenas instead of breakfast invitations. They came to my door after charges were filed. Millicent, with a tired dignity, tried to bargain. Trevor tried to bribe. Brittany cried like a child and offered a half-hearted apology. Mark answered the door for me and said nothing. I met them in our foyer and closed the door calmly behind me. "No," I said. "There is nothing you can give me that replaces what you took or what you almost took. The homes are stable. The residents are safe. That is what mattered." I returned their apologies like small coins. There was no grand moralistic monologue. There was a formal letter I had my lawyer send to each of them. A permanent no contact, a public statement of the misappropriation, and an insistence they not come within 100 feet of any Hearthside facility pending their legal matters. The court issued a civil restraining order later to keep them from accessing Ruth's affairs as well. The finality of the paperwork was a quiet music of order. They had to live with their reputation. Life after the public unmasking was not a melodrama. It was a slow, clean rebuild. Hearthside appointed an independent executive director, and I stayed on as a consultant for the short term to structure better governance, on one condition: no family member would ever serve in any fiscal oversight role again. I used a portion of the recovered funds to create an emergency payroll reserve and a training scholarship for caregiver certification in Ruth's name. I never told Ruth it was partly for her. She deserved it anyway. Mark and I had long conversations about boundaries. He had to face the reality that belonging to someone else's lineage didn't make those people kinder. He had to learn how to say no to them. We started couples therapy not because our marriage was in danger, but because we wanted to understand how to rebuild trust when family had been the vector of harm. He learned that silence can be a protection when used strategically, but also that partnership needs transparency. I learned to let him into the practical parts of my life. We found a better balance. Sometimes I think about the night when Brittany screamed at me in the parking lot of the station, "You ruined us!" She said it like a verdict. I stood there in the drizzle and watched her fury run out like paint down a wall. "No," I told her, "you ruined yourself." Now, months later, I sit in a kitchen lit by a thrift store lamp, listing the ways the world is steady again. The seniors have their aides, the gardens are tended, and Ruth visits the little therapy dog and calls me "My Claire" in a voice that now sounds like real love. The Hawthorne name still shivers in town gossip, but the heavy part of it, the exploitation, was cut away. They still ask to borrow sugar at holiday dinners, but we host fewer dinners with them. If there's a scene I'd replay, it's not the one with the warrants. It's the quiet moment afterward when Ruth took my hand and whispered, You kept my girls and boys safe. That's what matters. I cried then, not because I had humiliated the entitled, but because doing something right had cost me the cheapest kind of belonging. People sometimes ask, was it worth it? To make enemies? To call down a family's ruin? I answer this way. I didn't set out to ruin anyone for sport. I set out to protect people who couldn't protect themselves. When greed went public, it met a law that had been patiently prepared. Justice is not vengeance, it's structure, and structure can be as gentle as it is final. So here's the last thing I'll tell you. I still wear thrift store dresses because comfort matters more than labels. I still make coffee in the morning and drive the slow route to work because speed is a kind of arrogance. And when a cousin of Mark's passes my driveway and glances at me with a mix of hatred and curiosity, I smile. I don't gloat. I do something better. I open my calendar for volunteer hours at Hearthside and teach one of the new caregivers the ledger rules that protect wages. Because power is not a trophy, it's a responsibility. If you remember nothing else from this story, remember the small truth I learned the hard way. The quiet person who knows the rules can be more dangerous to thieves than the loudest siren. And in a world where family can be a weapon, sometimes the best revenge is to make sure the vulnerable are safe. If you like this story, tell me where you're watching from in the comments. Hit like and subscribe if you believe in steady, patient justice. Thank you for listening.